What if the person you trusted with your heart was the one who crushed it the hardest? What happens when your dreams are dismissed as worthless by the man you thought would support you through everything? And how do you rebuild when the world seems against you simply for who you love? The rain in Chicago that October evening felt like it was washing away more than just the city streets. I stood outside the coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, phone in hand, rereading Benjamin's last text for the 10th time. Colin, this isn't working. You're chasing fantasies while I'm building a real life. I need someone who gets that. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but nothing came. 2 years of stolen kisses in his car after late lectures, of whispering promises under the same blanket in our tiny studio apartment near campus, and it ended with a sentence that felt like a slap. Benjamin had always been the golden one, tall, sharp-jawed, the finance major everyone predicted would land at Goldman Sachs. I was the psychology student who spent nights scribbling notes about queer mental health, dreaming aloud about one day standing on a stage telling rooms full of people they weren't alone. He used to smile when I talked about it. Lately he just sighed. I walked home alone, the wind cutting through my coat. My parents back in Ohio still thought I was figuring things out. Mom sent weekly texts about church potlucks and nice girls from youth group. Dad never asked why I never brought anyone home. Coming out to them had been a half-finished sentence 3 years ago. Benjamin had been the only person who knew the full truth. Now even that safety net was gone. I unlocked the apartment door and stared at the empty spot where his suitcase used to sit. The silence pressed in like judgment. Was I really just a dreamer? Was loving another man always going to cost me everything? The next morning, I called my best friend Marcus from undergrad. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. Dude, what happened? I told him everything, words tumbling out between sobs I couldn't hold back. Marcus didn't hesitate. Pack a bag. You're crashing on my couch in New York. This city eats dreamers for breakfast but spits out legends by dinner. Time to prove him wrong. I booked the bus ticket that afternoon. Leaving Chicago felt like ripping off a bandage, but staying would have killed the last spark I had left. New York hit me like a freight train. Marcus's walk-up in Bushwick was loud, chaotic, and full of the kind of people who didn't blink at two guys sharing a bed platonically. I got a job at a bookstore in Brooklyn, shelving paperbacks by day and studying for my master's at night. The psychology program at CUNY was rigorous, but every lecture on identity formation felt like it was written for me. I started volunteering at a local LGBTQ youth center, listening to teenagers talk about the same shame I'd carried. Their stories mirrored mine. Fathers who turned away, exes who chose closets over courage. Slowly, the idea that had once been a whisper grew louder. Maybe I could turn pain into something useful. Maybe I could stand in front of people and say the words I wish someone had said to me. Benjamin's voice still echoed in quiet moments. You'll never make it, Colin. Speakers are for people with real stories, not guys who cry over textbooks. I pushed it down and kept moving. 6 months in, I submitted my first proposal to a small mental health conference in Philadelphia. The topic, the silent shame, navigating family rejection in queer youth. They accepted me for a 10-minute slot. My hands shook the entire train ride there. When I stepped onto the modest stage, the room had maybe 40 people. I spoke anyway, voice cracking at first, then steadying as faces nodded along. A woman in the front row wiped tears. A young man came up afterward and hugged me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. You just gave me permission to call my dad, he said. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Word spread quietly. Another invitation came, then another. I upgraded my wardrobe from thrift store button-ups to simple blazers that didn't scream struggling grad student. Marcus helped me rehearse in our tiny living room, timing my pauses, reminding me to breathe. You're not the guy Benjamin left behind anymore, he'd say. You're the guy who shows up for everyone else. I started dating again. Light, careful dates with men who respected my schedule and my scars. None of them lasted long, but each one taught me I could be wanted without having to shrink myself. Back in Ohio, my parents finally learned the truth when a cousin forwarded a video of me speaking at a small pride event. Mom called crying, Dad silent on the line. We love you, Mom said, but we don't understand. It stung, yet I didn't argue. I simply thanked her and kept living. The distance between us grew, but so did my voice. By the end of my master's, I had spoken at 7 regional events. My thesis on resilience in queer communities earned honors, and suddenly organizations were reaching out. Universities, nonprofits, even corporate DI panels. I booked my first paid gig, a keynote for a national youth summit in Washington, D.C. The fee covered 3 months' rent. I stared at the email and laughed until I cried. Benjamin had called my dreams worthless. Now strangers were paying me to share them. The night before the D.C. trip, I stood on the Brooklyn rooftop, city lights blurring below. Marcus handed me a beer. "You nervous?" I nodded. Terrified. What if I freeze? What if someone in the audience knows Benjamin and laughs? Marcus shrugged. "Then you remember why you started. Not for him. For the kid you used to be." I clinked my bottle against his and made a silent promise. No matter what, I would finish what I started. The conference hall in D.C. was bigger than anything I'd faced. 500 seats, bright lights, a podium that felt like a mountain. My topic had expanded, from rejection to resonance, building authentic lives beyond shame. I walked out to polite applause, heart hammering so loud I was sure the microphone picked it up. Then I began. I told them about the rainy Chicago street, about the text that ended everything, about the long bus ride to New York. I didn't name Benjamin, but every person in that room knew the feeling. When I finished, the applause wasn't polite anymore. It rolled like thunder. People stood. A line formed at the side of the stage. Young men, older women, parents clutching notes. One father said, "I drove my son here today because of your story. He's not speaking to me. After this, maybe he will." I signed books until my hand cramped, smiling through tears I refused to let fall until I was alone in my hotel room. That was the moment the shift became permanent. The next morning, my inbox exploded with requests. A major university wanted me for their spring series. A podcast invited me as a recurring guest. And then the email that stopped my breath. The National LGBTQ Leadership Summit in Los Angeles wanted me as closing keynote. 6 months away, 5,000 attendees, live-streamed worldwide. I accepted before I could second-guess myself. Life accelerated. I quit the bookstore, moved into a small one-bedroom in Manhattan with actual windows, and threw myself into writing the speech that would define me. Late nights at my desk, coffee gone cold, I wove together every fracture. Family silence, workplace microaggressions, the quiet fear that maybe Benjamin had been right. Each draft got stronger. Marcus flew in for a weekend to listen and gave me the only note that mattered. Tell them the truth, not the version that sounds pretty. So I did. Meanwhile, pieces of my old life resurfaced in unexpected ways. My sister in Ohio started texting memes about therapy. My parents sent a card on my birthday. Nothing profound, but the first time they acknowledged the date without pretending I was still their straight son. Small victories stacked like bricks. I even ran into an old college friend who had moved to New York for acting. He introduced me to a community theater group that performed queer stories. On stage one night, I played a version of myself from 5 years earlier, and the audience wept. Art and life blurred in the best way. The months before Los Angeles passed in a blur of airports and hotel rooms. I spoke in Denver, Atlanta, Seattle. Each time the crowd grew, the questions after grew deeper. Men approached me in their 40s admitting they had stayed closeted for decades because no one ever told them it was safe to dream bigger. I listened, hugged, exchanged emails. My calendar filled until I had to hire a part-time assistant. The kid who once shelved books was now paying someone to manage his schedule. The irony tasted sweet. Benjamin never left my thoughts completely, but the sting had dulled to a faint echo. I wondered sometimes if he ever saw the videos online. Part of me hoped he did. Part of me no longer cared. The man I had become didn't need his validation anymore. I had built my own. The night before the big summit, I stood on the balcony of my Los Angeles hotel, ocean breeze carrying salt and possibility. My speech notes were printed and highlighted. The suit I'd bought for the occasion hung inside. Tomorrow, 5,000 people would hear the full story, every scar, every choice, every hard-won step. Tomorrow I would stand where I had once only dared to imagine. And somewhere in the country, maybe Benjamin would see it too. The thought didn't scare me. It fueled me. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, ready for whatever came next. The auditorium in Los Angeles was a living thing. 5,000 seats filled, lights hot on my face, the low hum of anticipation rolling through the crowd. I adjusted the microphone, took one steadying breath, and began. 3 years ago, I stood in the rain in Chicago while the man I loved told me my dreams were worthless because I was gay. Today I stand here because I refused to believe him. The room went still. Then the nodding started, the quiet murmurs of recognition. I spoke for 40 minutes without notes, letting every emotion I had buried rise to the surface. I talked about the family that still struggled to say the words, "We accept you." About the workplace boss who once asked me not to bring my lifestyle to the office picnic. About the nights I almost gave up and the mornings I chose to keep going anyway. I named the fear, the shame, the quiet rage, and then I named the freedom on the other side. When I finished, the standing ovation lasted so long I had to wave them down. Cameras flashed. Organizers hugged me backstage. A producer from a national network slipped me a card. "We need voices like yours on morning shows." I floated through the after-party in a daze, shaking hands, signing programs, accepting compliments that still felt surreal. Then I saw him. Benjamin stood near the bar in a tailored suit, glass of scotch in hand, looking exactly like the man who once ruled my world. Our eyes met across the room. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he raised his glass in a small, almost reluctant salute. I didn't walk over. I didn't need to. The distance between us was no longer pain, it was proof. I turned back to the group of young activists surrounding me and kept talking, voice steady, heart full. The boy he had discarded had become the man the world now listened to. Later that night in my hotel, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. The story wasn't over, but the chapter that began in Chicago rain had closed. Tomorrow I would fly home to New York, to new invitations, to the life I had built one brave sentence at a time. Benjamin's words no longer defined me. My own voice did. The weeks after Los Angeles blurred into a steady rhythm of planes, podiums, and quiet hotel rooms where I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of everything I had carried. I landed back in New York on a crisp November morning. Marcus waiting at the airport with coffee and a ridiculous Speaker of the Year sash he'd ordered online. We laughed until we cried in the Uber, the kind of laughter that heals old wounds. "You did it, man," he said. "You actually did it." I nodded, but inside I knew the real work was just beginning. Success wasn't the stage. It was the mornings after when doubt still whispered. My inbox had become a full-time job. Universities in Texas, community colleges in rural Oregon, corporate retreats in Silicon Valley, all wanted the same thing. The story of the guy who turned rejection into resonance. I learned to say no to gigs that felt performative and yes to the ones that served real people. I started a small nonprofit scholarship fund for queer students pursuing mental health degrees, using half of every speaking fee. The first recipient was a 19-year-old from Alabama who reminded me so much of myself I almost couldn't read his thank you email without tearing up. Family dynamics shifted in slow, painful increments. My sister visited New York for a weekend and met Marcus. Over dumplings in Chinatown, she admitted Dad had watched one of my TEDx-style talks online and muttered, "He sounds like he knows what he's talking about." It wasn't an apology, but it was movement. Mom sent a care package with homemade cookies and a note that simply said, "Proud of the man you're becoming." I pinned it above my desk like a medal. The ache of their earlier silence didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled me. At a conference in Boston, I met Dr. Elena Rivera, a straight ally who ran a national program for LGBTQ educators. She pulled me aside after my panel and said, "You have the rare gift of making people feel seen without pity. We need you on our advisory board." I accepted, and suddenly my calendar included strategy sessions in D.C., Zoom calls with senator staffers, and late-night emails drafting policy language on conversion therapy bans. The dreamer Benjamin had mocked was now shaping the systems that protected kids like us. Winter brought its own tests. A snowstorm canceled flights, stranding me in Denver for 3 extra days. I spent them in a borrowed apartment belonging to a fellow speaker, reading the journals I'd kept since Chicago. Page after page showed the evolution, from raw heartbreak to measured anger to something softer, gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that forced me to grow. Gratitude for Marcus's couch. Gratitude for every kid who told me my words gave them courage. I closed the last journal and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, or maybe to the version of myself who had almost quit. Back in New York, the city felt different. I no longer walked past the old bookstore with nostalgia. I walked past it with pride. My apartment filled with small victories, a framed photo from the Los Angeles summit, a thank you letter from the first scholarship winner, a plant Marcus swore would survive if I remembered to water it. Dating remained cautious. I went on a few dates with a kind graphic designer named Liam, but when he asked about my ex, I realized I could talk about Benjamin without bitterness. That was progress. We parted as friends, and I felt lighter. Spring arrived with the biggest opportunity yet, a month-long speaking tour across the Midwest, the very region where my parents still lived. The organizer asked if I wanted to add a hometown stop in Ohio. I hesitated for exactly one day, then said yes. Facing the place where I had first learned shame felt necessary now. I rented a car and drove the familiar highways, cornfields rolling past like old memories. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, Mom was waiting on the porch. She hugged me so hard I felt the years we had lost. Dad stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. "Your mother showed me the video from DC," he said. You sound like a man who's figured things out." It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. That night we ate pot roast and talked, haltingly, awkwardly, about everything. No grand declarations, just small steps toward understanding. The hometown event was held at the local community college. The auditorium held 300 people, many of them former classmates, teachers, even the youth group leader who once prayed for my struggles. I stood on stage and told the truth without flinching. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but the real moment came afterward. A boy no older than 16 waited until the line thinned, then stepped forward. "I'm scared to tell my parents," he whispered. I handed him my card and said, "When you're ready, call me. You're not alone." His mother, standing behind him, nodded through tears. Healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a single card passed in a hallway. The tour continued through Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. Each stop added another layer to the man I was becoming. I learned to read the room, when to push harder on systemic change, when to soften and simply share the human story. I learned that some audiences needed data while others needed hope. And I learned that exhaustion was part of the privilege. Every time I wanted to cancel a flight, I remembered the Chicago rain and kept going. By the time I returned to New York, summer was heating the sidewalks. Marcus had redecorated my living room with a new couch, speaker-sized, he joked. We sat there late into the night, replaying stories from the road. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "Benjamin called me last week." I froze. Marcus raised a hand. He asked how you were doing. I told him to watch your latest talk instead of asking me. I laughed, surprised at how little it stung. The man who once held my future in his hands now had to Google me like everyone else. Closure tasted quiet and sweet. That summer I turned 30. I celebrated with a small rooftop party. Marcus, Elena, a few new friends from the nonprofit world, and Liam, who had become a platonic fixture in my life. We toasted to second chances, to voices that refused to stay silent, to the unlikely path from a rainy Chicago street to a stage that could hold thousands. Fireworks lit the skyline, and for the first time I felt completely at home in my own skin. The invitations kept coming. A TED Talk offer, a book deal with a major publisher, a request to testify before a congressional committee on youth mental health. Each one felt like another brick in the bridge I was building, not just for myself, but for every queer kid still standing in their own version of that Chicago rain. I said yes to all of them, because saying yes had become my new default. One quiet evening, I opened my laptop and started a new document. Title: The Speech I Never Thought I'd Give. I wrote about the boy who loved another boy, about the family that struggled to love back, about the friend who offered a couch instead of judgment, and about the man who learned that his worth was never up for debate. The cursor blinked patiently while I typed the final line. If you're listening and you're scared, know this: your story is already powerful. All you have to do is start telling it. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and stepped onto the balcony. The city hummed below, alive with possibility. Somewhere out there Benjamin might be watching a video, scrolling past my name. Somewhere out there a teenager in Ohio might be Googling how to come out. Somewhere out there, the next Colin was packing a bag for his own bus ride to New York. I smiled into the night and whispered the only truth that mattered anymore. I had made it. And the best part was, the story was only beginning. Fall brought new colors to Central Park and new layers to the work I was doing. The TED Talk filming happened on a crisp October morning in a studio downtown. I wore the same blazer I'd bought for Los Angeles, now feeling like armor rather than costume. The director gave me one instruction: speak like you're talking to the kid you used to be. So I did. I told the story of the text message that ended everything, the bus ride north, the first time a stranger hugged me after a speech. When the red light turned off, the crew clapped. The talk went live 2 weeks later and crossed 1 million views in a month. Comments poured in from every state, parents apologizing, young men thanking me, even a few exes of other speakers admitting they had been the Benjamins in someone else's story. The internet turned my pain into a movement, and I learned to hold the attention without letting it define me. The book deal closed before Thanksgiving. My editor, a no-nonsense woman named Carla who had edited 3 bestsellers on social justice, sat across from me at a cafe in Soho and said, "Don't give me inspiration porn. Give me the mess, the doubt, the days you wanted to quit." I wrote the manuscript in 4 months, waking at 5 a.m. to type before the city woke up. Each chapter became a letter to my younger self. Chapter 1, The Rain in Chicago. Chapter 2, The Couch That Saved Me. Chapter 3, The Stage That Found Me. When I turned in the final draft, Carla emailed back 3 words: "This will matter." Publication was set for the following spring. I stared at the contract and realized the boy who once hid his journal from Benjamin was now signing away rights to his most private truths for the world to read. The fear was real, but so was the freedom. Holiday season tested every boundary I had built. My parents invited me home for Christmas, the first time since I'd left. I drove through a snowstorm with Marcus riding shotgun for moral support. The house smelled of pine and ham, same as always, but the tension had softened into something almost gentle. Dad carved the turkey and asked real questions about my work. Mom cried when I gave her a signed advance copy of the book. "We're trying," she said. "That's all we can promise." I hugged them both and meant it when I said, "That's enough." On Christmas Eve, we sat by the tree and watched old home videos. In one clip, I was 10, playing baseball, already different in ways no one understood then. Dad paused the tape and said quietly, "I wish I'd seen you sooner." It wasn't everything, but it was more than I had dared hope for. New Year's Eve, I spoke at a massive gala in Times Square for a youth shelter. The ballroom glittered with lights and sequins, but the kids in the front row, runaways, foster youth, trans teens, were the real VIPs. I told them the story of the night. I almost deleted my college applications because Benjamin said I'd never finish. When I finished speaking, a 17-year-old named Jordan handed me a folded note. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to dream bigger than my fear." I pinned that note inside my jacket and carried it to every event afterward. Spring arrived with the book launch. The publisher rented a bookstore in the Village, the same street where I once shelved paperbacks for minimum wage. Hundreds showed up: old professors, new colleagues, complete strangers holding copies like lifelines. Marcus emceed, cracking jokes about the couch that started it all. Elena flew in from D.C. to introduce me. When I stepped to the microphone, I saw Benjamin in the back row. He wasn't hiding. He stood there in a navy coat, listening. Our eyes met for a long second. I didn't falter. I simply told the story the way it needed to be told, and when the signing line formed, he waited until the end. "You look good, Colin," he said quietly. I was wrong. I nodded. "I know." He left without asking for more, and I realized I didn't need anything from him anymore. The chapter had closed the moment I chose myself. The book hit the bestseller list 2 weeks later. Interviews followed: NPR, The New York Times, a primetime segment on a morning show. Each time the host asked, "How did you survive the rejection?" I answered the same way. I stopped asking the wrong person for permission to live. Viewers wrote letters. One mother from Kansas said her son came out after reading the chapter about the bus ride. Another man in his 50s said he left a 30-year marriage because my words gave him courage. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the reward. Summer brought the congressional testimony. I flew to Washington wearing the same blazer that had seen me through Los Angeles. The hearing room was wood-paneled and intimidating, but I spoke for the kids who couldn't. I read statistics, shared stories, then told my own. When the cameras cut away, a senator from California shook my hand and said, "Your voice changed the room today." Outside on the steps, I called Marcus. "We did it," I told him. He laughed. "No, you did it. I just provided the couch." The tour for the book took me across the country again: Phoenix, Portland, Austin, Minneapolis. In each city, I met people whose lives mirrored pieces of mine. A drag queen in Austin told me my book helped her accept her own masculinity. A father in Minneapolis admitted he had disowned his gay son and was now reading my book aloud to him over the phone. Every story added weight to the work, and every story reminded me why I could never stop. Back in New York, I started mentoring a small group of young queer speakers. We met twice a month in a community center, sharing drafts, practicing delivery, talking through the fear that still lived in all of us. One mentee, a 22-year-old named Sam, reminded me so much of myself that I gave him the spare key to my apartment and told him, "If you ever need a couch, it's yours." The circle had come full circle. By the end of that year, I had spoken on 4 continents via virtual events, published op-eds in major papers, and watched the scholarship fund send its 10th student to college. The man Benjamin once dismissed had become the voice thousands turned to when they needed hope. And still, every night before bed, I wrote one line in a private journal: "Thank you for the rain." It taught me how to grow. The new year started with an invitation I never saw coming: a 6-city European tour co-sponsored by an international LGBTQ alliance. Paris, Berlin, Madrid, London, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. I hesitated for exactly one day, then accepted because the kid from Ohio who once hid in his bedroom deserved to see the world. Marcus insisted on coming along for the first 2 stops as moral support. "Someone has to make sure you eat vegetables," he joked. We landed in Paris on a gray January morning, the Eiffel Tower shrouded in mist like a scene from every movie I'd ever loved. My speech at the Sorbonne was in English with simultaneous translation. The hall was packed with students from across Europe. I told the story in the same way I always did: honest, unpolished, human. When I mentioned the Chicago rain, a young man in the 3rd row began crying openly. Afterward, he waited in line and said in accented English, "My boyfriend left me the same way." I thought I would never speak again. Tonight I feel like I can. I hugged him and realized the story had outgrown borders. Berlin brought its own ghosts. Walking through the city where so many had once been forced into silence felt sacred. I spoke at a memorial event for queer victims of the Holocaust, my voice shaking as I connected past atrocities to present struggles. An elderly survivor approached me afterward, frail but fierce. "You are doing what we could not," she said. "Keep going." Her words became the fuel for every remaining stop. Madrid in February was warmer, the audience more expressive. They clapped and cheered and shouted, "CSE Pueda," after every powerful line. A local newspaper ran a full-page feature calling me the voice from America who reminds us we are never alone. I kept a copy in my suitcase like a talisman. London felt like coming home in a strange way: red buses, polite queues, and an audience that listened with the kind of intensity that made every word land heavier. At the end of the talk, a group of university students invited me to their Campus Pride Society. Over tea, they asked questions that cut straight to the heart. How do you forgive family who still don't fully understand? How do you keep going when the world tells you to shrink? I answered as best I could, then added the only truth I knew: you keep going because the alternative is letting someone else write your ending. Amsterdam surprised me with its openness. The city felt like a hug: canals reflecting lights, rainbow flags everywhere. My speech at the university was followed by a canal cruise where speakers and attendees mingled under string lights. I stood on the deck watching the water and realized how far the boy who once cried in a Chicago apartment had traveled. Marcus, who had flown home after Berlin, texted me a photo of the empty couch with the caption, "It misses you, but it's proud." Stockholm in late winter was cold and clear. The final speech of the tour happened in a modern glass building overlooking the harbor. I spoke about legacy, what we leave behind when we choose courage. When I finished, the entire room rose. The organizer handed me a small wooden medal engraved with the words, "For giving voice to the voiceless." I cried on the flight home, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that every mile, every tear, every doubt had been worth it. Back in New York, the apartment felt smaller yet safer. I unpacked souvenirs, a tiny Eiffel Tower keychain, a Berlin Bear figurine, a Madrid fan, and placed them on the shelf next to the note from Jordan. The European tour had expanded the reach of the work, but it had also reminded me why I started, one person at a time. Spring brought the paperback release and a new wave of speaking requests. I said yes to a summer residency at a prestigious writers' colony in upstate New York, where I would teach a workshop on turning personal pain into public power. 20 students arrived from across the country, teachers, therapists, artists, all queer, all carrying stories they wanted to share safely. For 2 weeks we wrote, revised, cried, laughed, and built a community that felt like the family I had always needed. On the last night we sat around a campfire, and each person read their strongest piece. When it was my turn, I read the opening chapter of the book aloud for the first time since publication. The silence afterward was holy. Then the applause started, soft at first, then thunderous. One student, a trans woman named Riley, hugged me and whispered, "You gave me permission to be loud." I drove home the next day knowing the residency had changed me as much as it changed them. Summer heat settled over the city like a blanket. I took a rare week off and rented a cabin in the Catskills with Marcus. We hiked, swam in cold lakes, and talked about everything except work. On the last evening, he asked the question I had been avoiding. "Are you happy, Colin?" "Really happy." I thought about the stages, the book, the kids who messaged me daily, the parents who were trying, the man I had become. "Yeah," I said. "I am." He grinned. "Good. Because you deserve it." Fall arrived with another milestone, the launch of my podcast, Resonance. Each episode featured a different guest, survivors, allies, activists, sharing the moment their voice found its power. The first episode was mine, recorded in the same studio where the TED Talk had been filmed. I told the full story again, this time with the distance of years and the perspective of thousands of lives touched. Listeners downloaded it 100,000 times in the first week. Emails poured in from people who said the podcast helped them come out to their spouses, their children, their churches. I read every single one, sometimes until 3 in the morning, answering when I could. The holidays that year felt different. I flew home to Ohio with actual presents instead of anxiety. Mom had baked my favorite pie. Dad had framed a newspaper clipping of my congressional testimony and hung it in the living room. We spent Christmas Eve watching old movies and laughing at memories we could finally share without shame. On Christmas morning, my sister announced she was pregnant, and for the first time I imagined being an uncle who could tell his niece or nephew the truth about who he was without fear. The circle was widening in ways I had never dared dream. New Year's Eve, I stood on the same Brooklyn rooftop where I had toasted my 30th birthday. This time the party was bigger. Marcus, Elena, Liam, Riley from the residency, even a few scholarship students. Fireworks exploded over the city, and I raised my glass. "To the rain," I said. Everyone cheered. They knew what I meant. The following year brought more growth, more travel, more proof that the path I had chosen was the right one. A major network offered me a limited series based on the book. I consulted on the script, making sure every scene honored the real pain and real hope. When the first episode aired, I watched it with Marcus on the new couch, the one that had replaced the old Salvation piece, and realized the story was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt despised for loving honestly. Through it all, I kept speaking, kept writing, kept listening. Because the work was never about fame or money or even revenge on an ex. It was about the kid standing in the rain somewhere tonight, reading a text message that breaks his heart, wondering if he will ever be enough. My job was to make sure he knew the answer was yes. The limited series premiered to strong reviews and even stronger conversations online. Clips of key scenes, especially the one depicting the Chicago rain, went viral. I received messages from strangers saying the show gave them language for feelings they had never named. One young man in rural Wyoming wrote that he watched the entire season in one night and then drove to the nearest city to attend his first Pride event. Another parent in Florida said the series helped her finally hug her son after years of distance. The impact felt enormous and humbling. I flew to Los Angeles for a panel discussion with the cast and sat beside actors who had portrayed versions of me and Marcus and even a fictionalized Benjamin. When a journalist asked how much was real, I answered honestly, all the pain, all the hope. The rest is just good lighting. The success of the series opened doors I hadn't known existed. A major university offered me a visiting professorship teaching a course on narrative psychology and queer resilience. I accepted for 1 semester, commuting from New York to Boston every week. The students were sharp, hungry, and diverse, some out and proud, others still carrying secrets. On the first day, I told them the same thing I told every audience. Your story is already powerful. My job is to help you tell it without apology. By midterm, they were writing essays that made me cry in my office. One student, a quiet engineering major named Theo, stayed after class one afternoon and said, I came out to my roommate last night because of your lecture on courage. He hugged me. I gave him the same advice I had given Jordan years earlier. Keep going. The world needs your voice too. Mid-semester, I flew to San Francisco for a gala honoring changemakers. The ballroom overlooked the bay, lights twinkling like stars on water. When they called my name for the Lifetime Impact Award, I walked to the stage feeling the full weight of every mile traveled. In my acceptance speech, I thanked the people who had made the journey possible. Marcus for the couch, Elena for the opportunities, my parents for trying, and yes, even Benjamin for the push I hadn't wanted but clearly needed. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is the one who accidentally sets you free, I said. The room rose in applause, and for the first time, I felt completely at peace with the past. Back in Boston, the semester ended with a student showcase. Each of the 25 students presented a 5-minute talk based on their personal stories. I sat in the front row, proud in a way I had never been proud of my own work. When Theo spoke about his journey from silence to pride, the entire auditorium cheered. Afterward, we all went for pizza, laughing and swapping stories until the restaurant closed. Driving back to New York that night, I realized the greatest gift of this career was not the stages or the book sales or the awards. It was watching other voices rise. Summer brought a new chapter. I bought a small house in upstate New York, an old Victorian with a wide porch and a yard big enough for the dog I had always wanted. Marcus helped me move, grumbling about carrying boxes up narrow stairs, but smiling the whole time. The first night I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and listened to crickets instead of sirens. Peace felt tangible. I adopted a rescue mutt named Echo, because every story deserved one, and within weeks he had claimed the entire couch as his throne. Life slowed just enough to let me breathe. Fall returned me to the road, but this time with Echo in tow for shorter trips. I spoke at colleges in the South, where the political climate made every word feel heavier. In Georgia, a young woman approached me after the talk and said, I'm not gay, but my brother is. Your story gave me the courage to defend him at Thanksgiving dinner. In Louisiana, a father admitted he had voted against marriage equality years ago and now regretted it after reading my book to his son. Every conversation chipped away at old divisions and built something new. Winter arrived with the publication of my second book, a collection of essays titled Resonance, Voices Beyond the Rain. The launch event was held at the same bookstore where the first book had debuted. This time the lines stretched around the block. Old friends, new mints, even a few family members from Ohio showed up. Mom and Dad flew in for the weekend, staying in the guest room of my new house. On the porch the night before the event, Dad said quietly, I'm proud of you, son. Really proud. The words landed soft and certain, and I knew we had crossed a bridge neither of us had known how to build. The holidays that year were the warmest yet. We hosted a big dinner. Marcus, Elena, Liam, Riley, Theo, and my family all around one long table. Laughter echoed off the rafters. Echo begged for scraps under the table. After dessert, I stood and raised a glass. To the people who believed when I couldn't, I said. Everyone clinked glasses, and for a moment the room felt like the future I had once only imagined. The new year started with a quiet resolution. I would take 1 month off every year to rest, write, and simply be. No stages, no interviews, no deadlines. I spent that first month in my house writing poetry I never intended to publish, just words for myself and echo. The dog didn't judge the bad lines. By the end of the month, I felt renewed in a way no audience applause could provide. Spring brought new mints and new projects. I started a free online course for anyone wanting to find their voice. Thousands enrolled from countries I had never visited. The comments section became its own community, people supporting one another across time zones and oceans. One participant from South Africa wrote, "Your story helped me come out to my village." They didn't understand, but they listened. Another from rural India said the course gave her the language to explain her identity to her parents. The work had become a global conversation, and I was simply the first voice that had dared to speak. Summer that year, I took Marcus and Echo on a road trip across the Pacific Northwest. We camped under stars so bright they hurt to look at. Around the fire one night, Marcus asked, "Do you ever think about Benjamin anymore?" I stared into the flames and realized the answer was almost never. "Only as a plot point," I said. The story moved on. He laughed and tossed a stick for Echo. The dog bounded into the darkness, bringing back something new every time, just like I had learned to do. Fall returned me to the stage with fresh energy. I spoke at the United Nations for an international panel on youth mental health. Standing in that historic hall, looking out at delegates from every nation, I told the story once more. This time the translation headphones carried my words to people who had never heard them before. When I finished, the applause echoed off marble walls built for peace. A delegate from Uganda approached me afterward and said, "In my country, we cannot speak. Thank you for speaking for us." I hugged her and promised to keep going. The year ended with a simple realization. I had become the man I needed when I was 22. The journey from despised to speaker wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about becoming the voice that could reach the next kid standing in the rain. And as long as there were kids like that, I would keep talking. The final years of the decade brought both expansion and reflection. The scholarship fund grew into a full foundation with chapters in 12 states. We funded not only tuition but therapy, housing, and mentorship for queer youth who had nowhere else to turn. I stepped back from daily operations but remained the public face, speaking at fundraisers where donors wrote checks after hearing the Chicago rain story one more time. Each check felt like another life protected. My third book, a collection of letters to queer youth, hit shelves on the 10th anniversary of the day I left Chicago. The launch party filled a ballroom in New York, but the real celebration happened the next morning when I visited the youth center where I had once volunteered. The kids there had grown up with my talks on their playlists. They greeted me like an old friend and asked for selfies and advice and hugs. One 14-year-old handed me a drawing of a stage with a tiny figure that looked suspiciously like me. "That's going to be me one day," he said. I pinned the drawing above my desk at home and never took it down. Marcus got married that year to a wonderful man named Javier. I stood as best man, giving a speech that made the entire room cry and laugh in equal measure. At the reception, Echo wore a tiny bow tie and stole the show by photobombing every picture. Watching my best friend dance under string lights, I felt the circle complete in a way I hadn't expected. The couch that saved me had become the foundation for many lives, including his. My parents celebrated their 40th anniversary with a quiet party in Ohio. I flew home with Echo and a suitcase full of gifts. Dad danced with Mom to an old song, and for the first time I saw them look at me without any lingering discomfort. After the guests left, Dad sat on the porch with me and said, "I spent years being afraid of what people would think. You spent years being brave. I'm learning from you now." The words landed like grace. We sat in comfortable silence watching fireflies until Echo decided it was time for bed. The speaking schedule remained full, but more intentional. I turned down offers that felt exploitative and accepted the ones that served specific communities, rural high schools, prison education programs, international Zoom calls with activists in countries where being gay was still illegal. Each talk carried the same core message: your worth was never up for debate. Every time I said it, I felt the words heal something in me too. On the 15th anniversary of that rainy Chicago night, I did something I had never done before. I flew back to the city and stood on the same corner where I had read Benjamin's text. The coffee shop was gone, replaced by a modern bakery, but the feeling of the rain stayed in my memory. I took a photo of the street and posted it with one line. 15 years ago, I thought my story was over. Today I know it was just beginning. The responses poured in from thousands of people who had followed the journey online. Many shared their own anniversary dates, the day they came out, the day they left home, the day they gave their first speech. The comments section became its own celebration. That evening I met Marcus for dinner in the same neighborhood where we had once shared his couch. Over pasta he raised a glass and said, "To the man who turned pain into purpose." I clinked my glass against his and added, "To the friend who made sure I never walked alone." We laughed until the waiter asked if everything was okay. Everything was more than okay. The years that followed brought grandchildren for my sister, new books, new stages, and the slow, steady realization that the work would outlive me. I mentored the next generation of speakers, young people who had grown up watching my talks on their phones. One of them, a non-binary activist named Kai, told me at a conference, "I used to think I had to choose between being loud and being safe. You showed me I could be both." Watching Kai step onto the same stage I once feared felt like passing a torch I had never meant to carry alone. In quiet moments I still wrote in the private journal. The entries grew shorter and more grateful. Thank you for the doubt. Thank you for the ring. Thank you for the courage that came after. Echo, now gray around the muzzle, slept at my feet while I typed. The house in upstate New York filled with memories, photos from every continent, letters from kids who had made it, the wooden medal from Stockholm. Life had become a beautiful accumulation of proof that one man's refusal to stay silent could change the world in small, stubborn ways. On my 45th birthday, I stood on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. Marcus and Javier visited with their adopted daughter. My parents drove up for the weekend. The table overflowed with food and laughter. After cake, I stepped outside alone for a moment and looked at the sky. Somewhere out there a young man might be reading a text that breaks his heart. Somewhere out there a family might be struggling to understand. Somewhere out there a stage might be waiting for a new voice. I whispered into the evening air the only thing that still needed saying, "You've got this. Just start telling your story." And I knew, deep in the place where rain once fell, that the words were true. In reflecting on Colin's journey from the pain of betrayal and societal rejection to becoming a voice that inspires thousands, the clearest lesson is that our worth is never defined by those who leave us behind. Every heartbreak, every doubt, every closed door can become the very path that leads us to our purpose if we choose courage over comfort. The story reminds us to speak our truth even when the world whispers we should stay silent, to build community when family falters, and to keep moving forward because someone else is always watching and waiting for permission to do the same. It's not about revenge or perfection. It's about refusing to let yesterday write tomorrow. If this tale touched you, carry that fire. Your story matters, and the world needs it now more than ever.